The story begins with a question nobody wants to ask. What if the people you trust most, your parents, your family, are hiding secrets so dark that they could shatter your entire life in a single moment? Imagine living in a world where the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones whose absence would leave a void that nothing could fill. This is the story of Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, a couple whose life seemed perfect from the outside, but whose private reality spiraled into a nightmare no one could have predicted. On Sunday, December 14th, the Reiner family's life ended in unimaginable tragedy. Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found stabbed to death in their $13.5 million Brentwood estate, a home that symbolized decades of success, hard work, and social prominence. Their son, Nick, 32, who lived in the guest house on the property, was arrested that very night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The bodies were discovered by their daughter, Romy, 27, whose eyewitness account would shake authorities and the public alike. She told investigators about a dangerous family member, a cryptic warning that would later gain haunting clarity. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. From the outset, this story raises questions that haunt every parent, every child, every observer. How could such violence erupt inside a family that outwardly appeared to have everything? How could the son of 2 devoted parents become the instrument of their destruction? And, crucially, what role did Michelle, the matriarch, play in this horrifying chain of events? For years, rumors suggested that Nick had violent tendencies, that his temper could flare with alarming intensity. And yet, according to reports, Michelle allegedly concealed these behaviors, allowing them to escalate unchecked. What decisions were made, and what secrets were kept, that ultimately turned a family's home into a crime scene? But this isn't just a story about murder. It's a story about love, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of denial. The Reiners were people who had lived under public scrutiny, yet few could have predicted that the darkest moments of their lives would unfold behind closed doors. Their home, a symbol of affluence and success, became a stage for tragedy, proving that wealth and status offer no immunity from human frailty. The horror of that December day is amplified by the realization that warning signs existed for years. Friends, relatives, and acquaintances reportedly noticed tensions, odd behaviors, and subtle indications of a volatile household. But when the signs were ignored, the situation spiraled beyond repair. From the outside, Rob and Michelle's marriage appeared stable, even enviable. They were partners in life, seen at social events, philanthropic functions, and gatherings that projected an image of harmony. But appearances can deceive. The reality, according to emerging reports and witness accounts, was far more complicated. Rob Reiner, in his final reflections, hinted at tensions and fractures in his marriage, truths that were only revealed posthumously through conversations, documents, and insider accounts. Michelle, meanwhile, may have played a dual role, devoted mother and, simultaneously, someone who allowed her son's destructive tendencies to go unchecked. How can one reconcile love for a child with complicity in inaction? How can a family navigate the razor-thin line between protection and neglect? And what happens when that line is crossed? The timeline of events on that fateful day adds to the chilling nature of this story. December 14th, a Sunday, began unremarkably for most families. Yet within hours, the Reiners' lives would be irrevocably changed. Multiple sharp force injuries ended the lives of Rob and Michelle, transforming a residence of comfort into a crime scene. The manner of death, officially listed as homicide, underscores the brutality and suddenness of the act. But beyond the forensic details lies a deeper question: why? What triggers the kind of violence that erupts within the very walls meant to protect and nurture? The answer is complex, woven from strands of personality, family dynamics, long-standing tensions, and critical decisions left unmade. As the investigation unfolded, Romy emerged as a central figure. She discovered the bodies and immediately raised alarm. Her statement to the authorities included a crucial detail: the presence of a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. In that single phrase, the tension of years of hidden family dynamics crystallized. It forced law enforcement, friends, and the public to confront a grim reality. The danger wasn't external. It wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. It was someone known, someone close, someone whose presence was woven into the fabric of daily life. The Reiner's story resonates because it forces us to examine uncomfortable truths about family. How often do we overlook or rationalize concerning behaviors in loved ones? At what point does enabling turn into tragedy? And, critically, how much do we really know about those closest to us, even in households that seem ideal, affluent, and harmonious? These questions aren't rhetorical. They are the backbone of this narrative, guiding us through the unraveling of a family whose outward perfection masked inner chaos. By framing the story around Rob Reiner's final confessions and the escalating violent tendencies of his son, we begin to understand the delicate interplay of love, fear, and inaction. Rob's revelations provide insight into a marriage strained by hidden truths and unspoken grievances. Michelle's role, whether out of denial, fear, or misplaced loyalty, adds a layer of complexity that challenges our understanding of morality and responsibility within a family unit. Each piece of the puzzle adds tension, suspense, and emotional weight to a narrative that is as shocking as it is tragic. As we move deeper into this story, keep in mind that what you are about to hear isn't just another crime report. It's an exposé of human behavior, a study of family dynamics, and a sobering lesson in how even the most seemingly ordinary households can harbor secrets capable of destroying everything. Every chapter that follows will peel back layers of deception, reveal contradictions, and challenge assumptions about love, loyalty, and the consequences of silence. So, what really happened that Sunday in Brentwood? How did his son become an instrument of death? And how did the actions, or inactions, of his mother contribute to a tragedy no one could have imagined? The answers lie in the details, the confessions, and the events leading up to that fateful day. And as we uncover them, one thing becomes painfully clear: some family secrets are not meant to be buried. They erupt violently, shattering lives and leaving questions that echo long after the headlines fade. But the most shocking revelation isn't just about the night of the murders. It's about the confessions Rob Reiner left behind. In his final reflections, he disclosed truths about his marriage, about Michelle, and about the son they raised that cast a new light on every assumption we had about this family. And what he revealed forces us to ask a chilling question. Could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had acted sooner? Or was it inevitable, hidden behind a veneer of love, privilege, and denial? The stage is set. The players are known. The story of the Reiner family is not only a tale of wealth, success, and public admiration. It's a cautionary chronicle of what happens when secrets, fear, and inaction converge in the most intimate corners of human life. The answers, the confessions, and the shocking truths lie ahead, waiting to be revealed. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They looked like a storybook family. Picture perfect. Smiles in every photo. Charitable events, elegant dinner parties, vacations that appeared effortless. From the outside, Rob and Michelle Reiner embodied success, stability, and warmth. People admired them, envied them even. Their home in Brentwood, sprawling and immaculate, was a reflection of decades of hard work, a $13.5 million estate that could have been the setting for a lifestyle magazine spread. But appearances, as this story will make painfully clear, can be deceiving. The first time anyone sensed anything off, no one spoke of it. There were whispers, half-formed observations, Nick's temper, small incidents of aggression that seemed out of proportion. Friends would shrug them off, assuming adolescence or stress. But for the Reiners, these moments were the beginning of a pattern that would escalate over years, quietly, invisibly, like a storm brewing beneath calm waters. Rob, by all accounts, was a loving father. He took pride in his family, devoted time to Romy and Nick, and appeared to support Michelle completely. Yet behind closed doors, tension simmered. According to some insiders, Rob and Michelle had disagreements that were subtle, almost invisible to visitors, but profound in their consequences. The nuances of a decades-long marriage, the small resentments, the quiet frustrations, can pile up until they become invisible pressure points. The Reiners' home may have been beautiful, but it was also a crucible of unspoken anxieties and fragile dynamics. Nick was central to this tension. From a young age, he displayed a temperament that worried both parents. School reports hinted at aggressive behaviors. Conflicts with peers and authority figures were more than typical teenage rebellion. They were red flags, signals that something deeper was brewing. Yet, according to reports, these early warning signs were often minimized or dismissed. Michelle, in particular, is said to have rationalized his behavior, excusing him or shielding him from consequences. Rob, on the other hand, seemed caught between hope and fear, wanting to protect his son, but aware that ignoring the problem could have serious repercussions. Life in the public eye complicated matters. For a family so visible, there was immense pressure to maintain appearances. Every dinner party, every philanthropic gala, every smile captured in a photograph had to align with the image of harmony. In that environment, admitting family dysfunction felt impossible. And so the Reiners' private struggles were kept behind closed doors, masked by charm, wealth, and social grace. Neighbors recount stories that hint at the underlying turbulence. Late-night arguments muffled behind closed doors, objects thrown in frustration, sudden silences that followed heated exchanges. There was a pattern, but it was subtle enough that casual observers might not notice. Even friends who visited the estate occasionally would comment on the elegance, the calm, the sense of order. And yet, the storm inside was growing stronger with each passing year, feeding on secrecy and inaction. Romy, the daughter, appears to have been acutely aware of the tension long before the tragedy. By all accounts, she had a more observational role within the family, noticing small details, sensing moods, and watching the escalation in Nick's behavior. While she may not have fully understood the gravity of the risk, she was positioned as a silent witness to the dynamics that would ultimately lead to catastrophe. The Reiners' public image was reinforced by their social circles, philanthropic involvement, and the outward successes of both children. To the world, Nick was an adult, successful in his own right. But behind the facade, the pressures and conflicts remained unresolved. The family's private life was a delicate balancing act. One wrong move, one unspoken acknowledgement, could tip the scale toward chaos. And in this case, the scale would eventually tip with irreversible consequences. As we look back at this perfect image, we begin to see the cracks that were hidden by charm and affluence. The tension between public perception and private reality is stark. Friends, neighbors, even casual acquaintances may have been fooled, but the truth was always simmering beneath the surface. Those who were closest, Romy, Rob, Michelle, and Nick, were living in a world of unspoken rules, hidden fears, and silent warnings. The tragedy that unfolded on December 14th was not a sudden, inexplicable event. It was the culmination of years of small, ignored signals. It was a storm that had been building quietly, relentlessly, in plain sight. Every harsh word, every unexplained outburst, every moment of denial contributed to the environment that made the unthinkable possible. And yet, for all the warning signs, no one could have predicted the scale of what was to come. The Reiners' perfect image had become a mask for volatility, and behind that mask was a story of fear, love, and ultimately, betrayal. The house that symbolized stability, achievement, and family unity would become the very site of horror. But what made this family dynamic so dangerous wasn't just the volatility of one individual. It was the interplay of personalities, the unspoken alliances, and the roles each family member played. Rob, Michelle, Nick, and Romy each had their part to play in the story, knowingly or unknowingly. And when these roles collided on that fateful day, the results were catastrophic. The first chapter of this story is about perception versus reality, about the dangerous illusions that wealth and status can create. It's about understanding that even in families that appear perfect, danger can hide behind smiles, charm, and meticulously curated appearances. The Reiners' life serves as a stark reminder. Appearances can mislead, and the most dramatic storms often brew in silence. And just as we begin to understand the fragile equilibrium of the Reiners' life, we are forced to confront a chilling question. How much did Michelle know about the danger her son posed, and why did she allow it to escalate? What would it take for a family to reach the point where love, fear, and inaction collide in such a devastating way? The answers lie ahead. The story of the Reiners family is only beginning, and the next chapters will reveal truths more shocking than the facade we've just seen. Secrets, confessions, and betrayals will come to light. Secrets that would have remained hidden if tragedy had not forced them into the open. From the outside, Rob and Michelle Reiner's marriage seemed like a partnership built on love, respect, and shared life goals. People saw a couple that had grown together over decades, navigating life's challenges with grace and composure. They were often photographed smiling at charity galas, social events, and family gatherings. Their home radiated warmth and elegance, a physical manifestation of their seemingly harmonious bond. Yet, as insiders and emerging reports suggest, appearances can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, the marriage told a far more complicated story. A story of unspoken tensions, conflicting priorities, and secrets that would eventually intersect with tragedy. Rob had always been devoted to his family. Colleagues and friends describe him as attentive, thoughtful, and deeply invested in the lives of his children. He was the kind of father who would attend recitals, coach from the sidelines, and take interest in every milestone. But devotion alone does not guarantee harmony. Beneath the surface, disagreements between Rob and Michelle reportedly simmered, often over decisions concerning their children, household management, and the future of their family. While outsiders might have seen minor disagreements or differences in opinion, these conflicts were, according to some accounts, far more serious than anyone realized. Michelle, for her part, was described as a nurturing mother and socialite. She cultivated an image of composure and warmth, managing not just her family, but the social expectations that came with wealth and status. However, reports suggest that she may have also had a complex, sometimes contradictory role within the family. On one hand, she was protective of her son, Nick, often shielding him from consequences and rationalizing his behavior. On the other hand, she may have inadvertently contributed to the family's volatile environment by failing to address dangerous tendencies head-on. This contradiction, love and enabling intertwined, created a tension that no outsider could easily perceive. Marriage, even under the best circumstances, is a negotiation between two people with distinct personalities, goals, and perspectives. In the Reiners' case, that negotiation was complicated by the presence of a son whose behavior increasingly defied explanation. Nick's violent outbursts were, according to sources, not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that had been building for years. Rob's awareness of this pattern and Michelle's decision to hide or minimize it created a dynamic where concern and fear coexisted with denial and hope. The emotional stakes were enormous. A father worried for the safety of his wife and daughter, a mother trying to protect her son, and a son whose behavior was escalating toward catastrophic violence. Adding to the strain were decades of shared experiences and accumulated expectations. Rob and Michelle had lived in each other's shadows for so long that small slights, misunderstandings, or unspoken resentments could fester unnoticed. In many long-term marriages, these silent pressures are common. What sets the Reiners apart is the way those pressures intersected with the dangerous behavioral patterns of their son. It wasn't just about personality clashes. It was about the consequences of ignoring warning signs in an environment where every day held potential for escalation. Insiders describe moments in which Rob tried to address conflicts directly. He reportedly voiced concerns about Nick's behavior, pushing for interventions that would prevent escalation. But these conversations were complicated by Michelle's protective instincts. To her, acknowledging the severity of Nick's behavior may have felt like betrayal or exposure of a family secret. Love, fear, and loyalty collided, creating a web of inaction that allowed tension to fester instead of resolve. It's important to note that this dynamic was not static. Over the years, it evolved, influenced by outside factors such as public perception, social pressure, and the family's wealth. Living in a world where appearances matter can intensify denial. To acknowledge dysfunction publicly is to admit failure, and for the Reiners, maintaining their social image may have compounded private stress. The result was a marriage that was outwardly successful but privately strained, a marriage caught between idealized perception and a complicated, often painful reality. Emotional spikes punctuated this tension. Sources recount moments of frustration, anger, and fear within the household. Arguments may have seemed ordinary to anyone who glimpsed them from the outside, but within the context of an escalating risk from Nick's behavior, they carried disproportionate weight. Small incidents, when ignored or rationalized, accumulated like dry brush in a forest, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. Amid these dynamics, the couple's love for their children remained a central motivator. Rob and Michelle's intentions were, by most accounts, rooted in care, concern, and a desire to protect. But love alone was insufficient to prevent tragedy. In fact, the very ways in which they tried to protect, through shielding, rationalization, and avoidance, may have inadvertently enabled escalation. This is the paradox of their marriage, a union bound by love but challenged by circumstances, personality, and critical, unaddressed risks. Direct questions to the audience are essential here. How would you handle a child whose behavior is increasingly violent? At what point does protection become enabling? And when does love become a factor in ignoring reality? These questions are uncomfortable but central to understanding the Reiners' story. The marriage also held contradictions in perception versus reality. Publicly, Rob and Michelle appeared united. Privately, their interactions were sometimes fraught with tension. Moments of tenderness existed, but they were interwoven with frustration, fear, and occasional helplessness. Observers could not reconcile the elegant dinner parties and smiling photographs with the accounts of private arguments, heightened tempers, and unspoken anxieties. This dichotomy, the polished public image and the turbulent private reality, is a recurring theme in the Reiners' story. The tension between Rob and Michelle also played a critical role in shaping Nick's behavior. Children observe not just what parents say, but how they interact, how conflicts are resolved or avoided. The unresolved conflicts, the protective shielding, and the unspoken rules about what could be expressed likely influenced Nick's perception of boundaries and consequences. In this environment, aggression and defiance could take root and grow unchecked, setting the stage for the violence that would later shock the world. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that Michelle's role is not simply one of a passive observer. Her decisions, what she allowed, what she concealed, and how she responded to warnings had a direct impact on the trajectory of events. Rob's confessions, revealed posthumously, suggest awareness of the danger, frustration at inaction, and a complex mix of love and fear. These dynamics highlight the often overlooked intersections between parental responsibility, marital negotiation, and child behavior. Ultimately, the Reiners' marriage was a delicate, precarious balance of love, fear, denial, and hope. It was a union that, on the surface, embodied success and stability, yet beneath that surface hid unresolved tensions and dangerous unspoken truths. The tragedy that would occur on December 14th was not merely the result of one individual's actions. It was the culmination of years of complex family dynamics, emotional conflicts, and critical decisions left unaddressed. And as we transition to the next chapter, we confront the figure at the center of these dynamics, Nick. His behavior, escalating over years, would eventually intersect with the decisions of his parents in a way that no one could have predicted. The question now becomes, how does a son, raised in an environment of love, privilege, and public admiration, become the catalyst for such a devastating event? The answer lies in the interplay of family secrets, unchecked behavior, and the critical moments that went unaddressed. Nick Reiner was never a child who fit neatly into expectations. From a young age, his temperament was unpredictable, volatile, and at times alarming. Friends and family would later describe him as bright and capable, yet prone to sudden outbursts that left even those closest to him uneasy. At first, these moments seemed like typical adolescent rebellion, slammed doors, raised voices, fleeting episodes of anger. But over time, patterns emerged, patterns that, in hindsight, were impossible to ignore. Nick's behavior escalated in subtle but telling ways. School records hinted at conflicts with teachers and peers, instances of defiance, and early struggles with authority. Family friends reported observing mood swings that could shift without warning. While these incidents might appear minor in isolation, the frequency and intensity suggested deeper emotional or psychological challenges. Parents and observers often rationalized his behavior. Perhaps stress, perhaps pressure, perhaps a phase that would pass. But rationalization would prove insufficient. Within the household, Nick's volatility created a pervasive tension. Rob, aware of his son's escalating behavior, reportedly attempted interventions. Conversations about responsibility, consequences, and accountability were held, some private, some visible only to family members. Rob's approach was a mixture of concern, firmness, and hope that guidance could redirect Nick's impulses. But these interventions were inconsistent, complicated by Michelle's protective tendencies. According to reports, Michelle often rationalized or dismissed Nick's actions, a choice that may have inadvertently reinforced his sense of impunity. The dynamics at play were intricate. Nick's outbursts were not isolated events. They interacted with the family's emotional and relational patterns. When a parent shields a child from consequences, aggression can be reinforced rather than corrected. At the same time, the tension generated by unchecked behavior can erode parental authority, leaving both parents in a difficult position. How to discipline without provoking escalation, how to enforce boundaries without triggering violence. In the Reiners' case, this tension was compounded by decades of accumulated patterns and emotional history. Over the years, neighbors and acquaintances noticed troubling behaviors. Late-night arguments, doors slammed with force, sudden outbursts of anger. These were moments that hinted at underlying instability. Friends who visited occasionally might have been unaware of the full context, but the clues were there for those paying attention. Within the home, these behaviors contributed to a climate of anxiety, where every interaction could potentially trigger conflict. Nick's relationships outside the family also reflected his struggles. Friends and colleagues described episodes of intimidation, aggression, or manipulative behavior. The consistency of these patterns, across multiple settings, suggested that the problem was not confined to the household. Yet, within the family, the stakes were higher. Emotional bonds, parental love, and loyalty complicated any straightforward response. Actions that might have been appropriate in other contexts were tempered or inhibited entirely by the complexities of family attachment. Michelle's role in this dynamic is particularly significant. Reports indicate that she often acted to protect Nick from repercussions, rationalizing his behavior or attempting to minimize its impact. Whether motivated by love, fear, or denial, this choice had consequences. By shielding him, she may have unintentionally allowed his violent tendencies to grow unchecked, contributing to an environment in which the escalation toward tragedy became more likely. The emotional landscape of the Reiner household was complex. Rob's concern, Michelle's protective instincts, and Nick's volatility interacted in ways that created both tension and blind spots. Each family member's actions, or inactions, played a role in shaping the trajectory of events. What might have seemed like isolated incidents or minor conflicts were, in fact, threads woven into a larger pattern that would culminate in a devastating outcome. Direct questions to the audience emerge naturally here. How do you address aggression in someone you love? When does intervention become confrontation, and when does protection become enabling? Could this pattern have been stopped if addressed differently, or was the path toward tragedy inevitable once the cycle began? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are critical to understanding the unfolding events. As Nick matured, his behavior reportedly continued to escalate. Minor frustrations could trigger intense emotional reactions. Family arguments sometimes erupted into shouting matches or property damage. While Rob attempted to impose boundaries, Michelle's responses often counteracted these efforts. The resulting push and pull created a volatile environment, a climate where anger was amplified, boundaries were unclear, and consequences were inconsistent. At the same time, there were glimpses of normalcy. Nick could be charming, capable, and socially adept. Friends and acquaintances were often struck by the contrast between his public demeanor and the private turbulence reported by family insiders. This duality added another layer of complexity. The same person who could present as polite and successful in public could, in private, become uncontrollably violent. It is a phenomenon that psychologists often describe as compartmentalization, splitting behaviors across different contexts, which can make warning signs harder to interpret and predict. Despite these warning signs, many outside observers were unaware of the potential danger. To them, the Reiners were still the picture-perfect family, the loving parents and their talented children. The dissonance between public perception and private reality highlights one of the central tragedies of this story: the invisible escalation of risk. Violence and instability, hidden behind closed doors and carefully maintained facades, quietly gathered momentum until it could no longer be contained. As we reflect on this chapter, it is clear that Nick's dark side was not a sudden emergence. It was the result of years of complex interplay between personality, family dynamics, and unaddressed warning signs. Each incident, each outburst, each rationalization contributed to an environment primed for disaster. The Reiners' attempts to maintain a sense of normalcy, combined with love, fear, and denial, created conditions in which tragedy could flourish. And as the story moves forward, we begin to see how these tensions intersected with critical decisions, missed opportunities, and concealed truths. The next chapter will explore the hidden patterns within the Reiners' household, the ways Michelle concealed and rationalized dangerous behavior, and the events leading directly to the night of December 14th, a night that would forever redefine the family story. In any family, there are layers. There is the life everyone sees, the curated image shared with friends, neighbors, and social circles. And then there is the private life, the conversations never spoken aloud, the moments hidden in rooms with closed doors, the tensions that simmer quietly yet persistently. In the Reiner household, those hidden layers were thick with secrets, and the consequences of those secrets would prove devastating. From the outside, Rob and Michelle's home exuded order, warmth, and elegance. But inside, the atmosphere was often tense, unpredictable, and laced with unspoken fears. Neighbors later described hearing arguments, doors slamming, and muffled shouts that suggested a household under stress. Friends recalled visiting and sensing something off, though it was difficult to pinpoint. The Reiners maintained appearances impeccably, masking the friction beneath a veil of charm and social grace. It is a stark reminder that outward appearances rarely tell the full story of family life. Nick's escalating behavior was central to these hidden tensions. What outsiders might dismiss as teenage rebellion or occasional anger had, in reality, become a recurring pattern of volatility. His outbursts were unpredictable, often violent, and increasingly dangerous. Yet Michelle allegedly took steps to conceal these behaviors from both Rob and the outside world. According to sources, she rationalized his actions, downplayed incidents, or removed evidence of his aggression. In doing so, she may have inadvertently contributed to an environment where warning signs were ignored or misunderstood, allowing escalation to continue unchecked. Rob's position in all of this was uniquely painful. He was a father aware of danger, a husband striving to maintain stability, and a man trying to protect both his wife and his children. His attempts to confront Nick, establish boundaries, and impose consequences were complicated by Michelle's interventions. When one parent shields and the other attempts to enforce rules, conflict becomes inevitable, and the child receives mixed signals about acceptable behavior. In the Reiner household, this dynamic fostered tension and confusion, an unstable foundation on which violent tendencies could grow. Emotional spikes punctuated daily life. Moments that might seem minor in another household, a harsh word, a slammed door, a broken object, took on amplified significance within the Reiner family. The atmosphere was unpredictable. Those who lived there, especially Romy, reportedly sensed a constant undercurrent of danger. The household became a place where normal activities were fraught with anxiety, where the risk of escalation hovered over every interaction. This is where the secrecy becomes crucial. Michelle's alleged concealment of Nick's behaviors extended beyond simply hiding incidents. It involved actively downplaying their significance to Rob and others, framing them as temporary frustrations rather than persistent patterns of aggression. By doing so, she controlled the narrative within the household, influencing how each family member interpreted events. The consequences of this secrecy were profound. Rob's awareness of danger was mitigated by doubt and uncertainty, and Nick's violent impulses continued without effective intervention. Romy's perspective is particularly illuminating. As the daughter and eventual discoverer of the tragedy, she occupied a unique vantage point. She reportedly noticed subtle warning signs, sensed growing tension, and understood aspects of the household dynamic that outsiders could not. Her observations, when shared with authorities after the murder, highlighted both the escalating danger and the protective measures that Michelle allegedly used to hide it. Romy's role underscores the ways in which secrets within a household can have ripple effects, influencing perception, response, and ultimately, outcomes. There were also contradictions that added to the tension. Michelle's public persona, nurturing, composed, socially adept, stood in stark contrast to the private reality of shielding a son capable of violence. Friends and acquaintances would never have suspected that behind the elegance of Brentwood gatherings lay a family on the brink of disaster. The tension between appearance and reality is a recurring theme in tragedies of this nature. The very effort to maintain perfection can exacerbate hidden dysfunction, delaying intervention until it is too late. Direct questions to the audience arise naturally here. How much of family life do we truly see, even as friends and neighbors? Could you detect danger if it was deliberately concealed? And, most chillingly, what are the consequences when warning signs are hidden behind layers of denial and protection? These questions frame the story as not just a chronicle of a tragic event, but also as a meditation on human behavior, perception, and responsibility. The buildup of these secrets reached a tipping point over the years. Small incidents, when concealed or rationalized, compounded into a dangerous pattern. Arguments went unrecorded in memory, physical outbursts minimized, and warning signs dismissed. By the time the household approached December 14th, the latent tension had transformed into a combustible environment. The interactions that had once been moments of parental frustration or sibling rivalry now had the potential to erupt into violence. And yet, for all the secrecy and tension, the Reiners maintained the external semblance of normalcy. Family gatherings, public appearances, and interactions with friends continued as if everything were fine. This duality, the visible perfection and invisible chaos, made the eventual tragedy all the more shocking. Those who believed in the image of the Reiners could not imagine that violence was brewing within the walls of the very estate that symbolized comfort, success, and safety. The secrets behind closed doors were not limited to concealment of behavior. They also involved omissions of discussion and avoidance of confrontation. In families, sometimes the silence about danger or dysfunction can be more harmful than the dysfunction itself. Michelle's shielding, combined with Rob's cautious interventions and Nick's unpredictable behavior, created a cycle where issues were neither fully addressed nor adequately managed. The emotional environment became a pressure cooker, with every small incident adding fuel to the fire. And then came the night that would change everything. The combination of volatility, secrecy, and escalating tension reached a climax that no one could have predicted, except, perhaps, those who had been watching the patterns unfold for years. Romy, the observant daughter, would soon discover the devastating consequences of these hidden truths. The events that night were the result of accumulated patterns of behavior, decisions made and unmade, and secrets carefully guarded until they could no longer be contained. The lesson here is stark and unnerving. Secrets in a household, especially those concerning safety and behavior, are rarely neutral. They shape perception, influence responses, and, in extreme cases, can create the conditions for catastrophe. In the Reiners' case, the concealment of Nick's behavior, combined with complex family dynamics, directly contributed to the tragedy that would unfold. As we move forward, the story shifts toward the fateful day itself. The next chapter will delve into the events of December 14th, exploring how the carefully hidden tensions, unspoken fears, and volatile behaviors converged into a single, catastrophic moment. December 14th began like any other Sunday, at least on the surface. The sun rose over the sprawling Brentwood estate, casting light over manicured lawns and gleaming windows. Inside, the Reiner household operated under its usual rhythms: breakfast, quiet conversations, the occasional laughter, and the undercurrent of tension that had long been part of family life. But beneath the calm, the storm that had been building for years was gathering strength, poised to explode in ways no one could have imagined. Rob and Michelle, despite their decades together, were acutely aware of the family dynamics that had been straining under the weight of secrecy and fear. Reports suggest that Rob had grown increasingly concerned about Nick's behavior. His attempts at guidance, intervention, and boundary setting had met with mixed results. Michelle, in her protective stance, reportedly continued to rationalize or shield Nick's escalating volatility. This day, like so many before it, would be shaped by the collision of awareness, inaction, and the unpredictable force of Nick's temperament. Nick, at 32, lived in the guest house on the property, a physical separation that symbolized both independence and isolation. He had been showing signs of agitation in the days leading up to December 14th, tension that was noticeable, though perhaps not alarming to those accustomed to his history of unpredictable behavior. Inside the main house, Rob and Michelle carried on with their routines, likely unaware of the immediacy of the danger that Nick posed that day. The stage was set for a tragedy whose scale and ferocity would shock everyone who thought they understood this family. The morning reportedly passed with ordinary domestic interactions, breakfast, minor household tasks, small talk. But as afternoon approached, the tension in the household began to intensify. Accounts suggest that minor disagreements or irritations escalated quickly when they intersected with Nick's unpredictable temper. The volatile mix of long-standing family dynamics, unresolved tension, and suppressed emotions created a dangerous environment, an environment where a single trigger could ignite catastrophic events. Observers and insiders who have later pieced together timelines describe a series of interactions that, while seemingly minor, were fraught with underlying significance. Nick's behavior during these hours reportedly included verbal confrontations and signs of agitation. Rob, aware of his son's history, may have attempted to calm or reason with him, while Michelle's interventions reportedly focused on minimizing conflict, perhaps in an effort to maintain peace or avoid escalation. Yet in families with complex, unresolved tensions, such attempts can sometimes backfire, creating frustration and amplifying existing volatility. The hour of tragedy approached like a shadow. Nick's violent tendencies, the unresolved parental conflict, and years of suppressed warning signs collided. Multiple sharp force injuries ended the lives of Rob and Michelle inside the main house. The brutality of the act, the suddenness, and the intimate nature of the crime. The perpetrators and victims were family, added layers of horror that would reverberate through the community and the media. This was not a random act of violence. It was the culmination of patterns, tensions, and decisions made, or left unmade, over decades. Romy's discovery of the bodies later that evening added another dimension of horror. According to reports, she immediately recognized that something was gravely wrong. Her statement to authorities included a critical detail: the presence of a dangerous family member, someone who should be considered a suspect. That single phrase, uttered in the immediate aftermath of trauma, highlighted the patterns of behavior and concealed danger that had long existed within the household. Romy's quick recognition of the threat underscores both her awareness of family dynamics and the devastating clarity that comes in moments of crisis. The timeline of the murder, pieced together through investigative reports, suggests that the events unfolded rapidly once escalation began. What had simmered for years erupted with devastating finality. Rob and Michelle's lives were extinguished within the confines of their home, a place meant for security and love. The juxtaposition of domestic familiarity and sudden violence is profoundly unsettling. The very walls that provided comfort and identity for decades became the site of the ultimate betrayal of safety. Public reaction in the immediate aftermath was one of shock and disbelief. The Reiners were known, admired, and respected. The news that both parents had been killed by their own son stunned neighbors, friends, and the broader community. Social media erupted with speculation, concern, and grief. The narrative of a perfect family was shattered almost instantly, replaced by questions, rumors, and the painful reality of a household that had been hiding deep, dangerous secrets. Law enforcement quickly focused on Nick as the primary suspect. His history of volatility, coupled with Romy's eyewitness account, directed investigators toward him. The arrest, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, marked the beginning of a legal and psychological examination into the family's private life. Questions about motive, prior warnings, and responsibility became central to both the public conversation and the formal investigation. The chilling aspect of this tragedy is not just the act itself, but the build-up to it. Each small incident, each rationalization, each act of concealment contributed to an environment in which disaster became increasingly likely. The violence on December 14th was not an isolated eruption. It was the climax of patterns that had long existed, unseen or dismissed by those not directly involved. The household had become a pressure cooker, and on that day, the lid finally blew off with devastating consequences. Direct questions to the audience linger in the aftermath. Could this have been prevented? Were the warning signs clear enough that intervention could have changed the outcome? And perhaps most haunting, when danger is within your own family, how do you recognize it before it's too late? These are questions that defy easy answers, but are central to understanding the complexity and tragedy of the Reiner story. As we move into the next chapter, the focus will shift from the events themselves to the immediate discovery and investigation. Romy's perspective, the police response, and the initial understanding of the crime reveal not only the horror of what happened, but also the patterns and warning signs that, in retrospect, make the tragedy almost inevitable. The next chapter will uncover the chilling aftermath and the first glimmers of a truth the world was only beginning to comprehend. The discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's bodies was a moment that would define the tragedy for years to come. It was Romy, their 27-year-old daughter, who stepped into the scene that no one should ever face. The aftermath of unimaginable violence within the very home that had been meant to protect and nurture her family. In that instant, the delicate balance of appearances, secrecy, and suppressed tensions collided into raw, undeniable horror. Romy's account, shared with authorities, paints a picture of shock, urgency, and clarity. She reportedly found the bodies within the main house, immediately recognizing that the threat came from within the family, not from an external intruder. Her statement that there was a dangerous family member who should be a suspect would later prove prescient. It encapsulated what had been known privately for years, that Nick, her brother, had exhibited violent tendencies and that these behaviors were a serious, ongoing concern. The horror of discovery is amplified by the recognition that warnings had existed all along, hidden in plain sight, yet ignored or rationalized. The scene itself was gruesome and disorienting. Reports indicated multiple sharp force injuries, the official cause of death confirming what was tragically apparent: homicide. The intimate nature of the crime, the parents murdered in their own home by their own son, added a psychological layer of shock that would resonate through the investigation, the media, and the public imagination. Law enforcement officers described a scene charged with tension, silence, and the lingering aura of violence. Each step within the house would have carried weight, both literal and metaphorical, as investigators began to piece together the sequence of events. From a procedural standpoint, the discovery marked the start of a complex investigation. The initial focus was on preserving the scene, interviewing immediate witnesses, and understanding the dynamics that had led to the tragedy. Romy's eyewitness account became central, providing insight into not only the timeline, but also the history of tension within the household. Her observations highlighted years of concealed risk, protective actions, and family patterns that had contributed to the fatal outcome. The impact on Romy herself cannot be overstated. To find one's parents murdered by a sibling is an experience of trauma that is both immediate and enduring. Psychological studies of familial homicide suggest that the survivor's perspective is uniquely complex, encompassing grief, fear, confusion, and often a conflicted sense of loyalty. Romy's ability to recognize danger in the moment, to report accurately to authorities, speaks to a heightened awareness that had developed from years of observing and navigating her family's private tensions. The broader community was stunned as news spread. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues struggled to reconcile the public image of the Reiners, a successful, loving, and admired couple, with the private horror that had occurred. Media coverage quickly honed in on the family dynamics, Nick's history of volatility, and Michelle's alleged role in concealing his behaviors. The juxtaposition of wealth, social prominence, and extreme violence created a narrative that both fascinated and horrified the public. In the hours following the discovery, investigators began assembling the facts. Timelines were reconstructed, forensic evidence cataloged, and interviews conducted with neighbors and friends. Romy's role as the initial discoverer and reporter of the crime was pivotal in directing the investigation toward the reality that the perpetrator was likely a family member. Every detail of her account, the timing, the state of the house, the nature of her interactions with Nick in the hours before discovery, was scrutinized to understand how a seemingly normal family day had turned into a scene of tragedy. Direct questions to the audience surface here. How do you process discovering a loved one has been murdered by someone you know? Could any prior action have prevented this? Or was the outcome the inevitable product of long-buried tensions? What responsibility do parents bear when warning signs in their children are ignored or concealed? These questions deepen the emotional engagement with the story, emphasizing not only the horror of the act, but the cumulative weight of familial dynamics leading to it. The investigation also began revealing patterns that had been invisible to outsiders. Multiple neighbors recounted past incidents of arguments, loud disturbances, and signs of tension, adding context to the scene. Each recollection reinforced the notion that the tragedy, while shocking in its immediacy, was the culmination of years of escalating risk and mismanaged conflict. The house, which had been a symbol of comfort and prestige, was now emblematic of hidden danger. The stark contrast between appearance and reality made tragically clear. As authorities worked to piece together the circumstances, Nick's profile emerged as central to understanding the events. His history of aggression, the family's internal handling of his behavior, and Michelle's protective interventions all converged in the narrative that investigators began to build. The discovery of the crime was more than just the moment the bodies were found. It was the point at which the hidden story of family dysfunction, secrecy, and escalating violence became visible to the world. The gravity of discovery also extended to legal and emotional dimensions. The arrest of Nick, the charges of 2 counts of first-degree murder, and the subsequent media scrutiny were only the beginning of a broader exploration into responsibility, family patterns, and the psychology of domestic homicide. Every decision, every past rationalization, and every unspoken tension was now being examined under a public microscope. As we move to the next chapter, the focus will shift to the legal proceedings, the investigation, and the shocking revelations about Nick's behavior in the weeks and months leading up to December 14th. This chapter marks the transition from immediate shock to deeper understanding, revealing how family dynamics, parental decisions, and long-concealed behaviors culminated in the ultimate act of violence. The arrest of Nick Reiner was swift, yet it only marked the beginning of a complex and emotionally charged investigation. Law enforcement had to navigate a delicate web of family dynamics, public scrutiny, and forensic evidence, all while addressing a case that involved domestic homicide, the most intimate and psychologically challenging type of crime. From the moment officers arrived at the Brentwood estate, the narrative of tragedy, secrecy, and betrayal began to unfold in ways that shocked both the authorities and the public. Police reports indicate that Romy's immediate statements were instrumental in shaping the investigation. She identified Nick as a person of interest, describing behaviors that had long been a source of tension in the household. Her observations provided law enforcement with both context and urgency, making it clear that the danger had originated from within the family. Investigators had to balance the trauma of a grieving daughter with the procedural necessity of gathering evidence, establishing timelines, and reconstructing events leading to the murders. Inside the estate, the scene was meticulously documented. Multiple sharp force injuries confirmed the official cause of death for Rob and Michelle, and investigators began piecing together the moments before the tragedy. Forensic teams analyzed weapon placement, room access, and the sequence of interactions to determine how the murders had occurred. Every detail mattered: the placement of objects, the state of rooms, and the behavior patterns evident in the house offered insights into the events of December 14th. The investigation quickly highlighted long-standing family tensions. Reports from neighbors, friends, and acquaintances described a household where arguments were frequent, doors were slammed, and sudden outbursts were a recurring feature. These insights helped authorities understand that Nick's behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader, escalating pattern that had been tolerated, rationalized, or concealed over time. Michelle's alleged shielding of Nick's behavior became a focal point, raising questions about parental responsibility, enabling, and the interplay between love and accountability. Public reaction was immediate and intense. The Reiners were known and admired in social circles, and the news of such a shocking familial homicide spread rapidly. Social media platforms became inundated with speculation, grief, and outrage. Headlines emphasized the apparent contradiction between the family's public image, a picture of success, love, and stability, and the private tragedy that had unfolded. For many, the juxtaposition of wealth, status, and violence created an unsettling narrative. Even the most seemingly perfect families are vulnerable to hidden dysfunction. Media coverage did more than report events. It began to analyze the family dynamics that had led to the tragedy. Reporters, experts, and commentators explored Nick's history of aggression, the parents' interventions, and Michelle's alleged role in concealing warning signs. The public became increasingly invested in understanding not just the what of the murders, but the why. The psychological, social, and familial factors that converged to create the fatal outcome. Investigators also faced the challenge of discerning motive. While domestic homicides are often emotionally complex, the Reiners case involved layers of psychological nuance. Nick's behavioral history, combined with parental dynamics, public pressures, and long-suppressed tensions, created a web that investigators had to carefully untangle. Every interview, every piece of evidence, and every prior report became a thread in the larger narrative, connecting long-term patterns to the events of December 14th. Direct questions to the audience are unavoidable. How do family dynamics contribute to violence? Could intervention have changed the outcome, or was the trajectory inevitable once certain patterns were established? What responsibility does a parent bear when warning signs are ignored, rationalized, or hidden? These questions underscore the complexity of the investigation and highlight why the Reiners' story resonates far beyond the immediate tragedy. The investigation also shed light on the broader consequences of secrecy. Michelle's alleged attempts to minimize or conceal Nick's violent tendencies were no longer just private matters. They were central to understanding how the household dynamic may have enabled escalation. Investigators had to consider not just the act itself, but the years of context leading up to it. Every decision, every omission, and every rationalization became a piece of the puzzle, revealing how invisible pressures and hidden truths contributed to the catastrophe. Public reaction ranged from shock to grief to incredulity. Neighbors who had interacted with the family casually were forced to reconcile their perceptions with reality. Friends and acquaintances struggled to understand how a household that seemed elegant, successful, and harmonious could harbor such danger. The story became a mirror reflecting the uncomfortable truth. Appearances can deceive, and the most violent disruptions often occur where they are least expected. As law enforcement and the public absorbed the unfolding story, questions of accountability and prevention dominated discussions. Experts in family psychology emphasized the dangers of enabling behavior, concealed aggression, and unaddressed familial tension. Social media commentators debated parental responsibility, mental health intervention, and the warning signs that had been ignored. The investigation, in this way, became not only a search for justice, but also a broader examination of human behavior, decision-making, and the fragile boundaries of domestic safety. The stage was now set for the next phase of the story, the legal proceedings, the mounting evidence against Nick, and the uncovering of truths that would shock even those closest to the family. Every chapter of the investigation would reveal more about the patterns of behavior, the concealed violence, and the long-term consequences of choices made by parents, siblings, and a son whose temper had escalated unchecked. When news of Rob and Michelle Reiner's murder broke, it sent shockwaves not only through their social circle, but across the nation. The combination of wealth, status, and the horrific nature of the crime made the story irresistible to media outlets and the public alike. Headlines splashed the tragedy across news sites and social platforms, framing it as both an unthinkable act and a cautionary tale about hidden family dysfunction. Amid this intense scrutiny, the reactions of the surviving family members added another layer of complexity, revealing the human cost behind a story that was already sensational. Romy, the daughter who discovered the bodies, became the inadvertent center of attention. The weight of trauma she carried was unimaginable. The grief of losing both parents, the horror of knowing her brother was accused, and the pressure of being thrust into public view. Friends and acquaintances later described her as quiet, composed, and resilient, but anyone who truly knew her understood the depth of emotional turmoil she must have felt. Her immediate response, directing authorities to Nick as a suspect, demonstrated a mix of clarity and courage. She recognized the danger when others might have been paralyzed by fear or shock. Yet even as she provided crucial information, Romy faced the painful duality of familial loyalty and justice, a tension that would haunt her for months. Nick's extended family reacted with disbelief and horror. Close relatives struggled to reconcile the image of a successful, seemingly balanced man with the brutal accusations leveled against him. Many expressed grief for the loss of Rob and Michelle, confusion over Nick's motives, and anger at the unthinkable act. Social media amplified every reaction, turning private pain into public spectacle. Friends and distant relatives debated, sympathized, and criticized, creating a cacophony of opinion that both magnified the tragedy and complicated the grieving process for those directly involved. The media frenzy intensified quickly. Every outlet, from tabloids to reputable news organizations, sought to uncover details about the family's history, Nick's behavior, and the dynamics that might have led to the killings. Social platforms buzzed with speculation, analysis, and sometimes misinformation. Photos of the Reiner estate, family portraits, and public appearances were dissected for clues about the family's private life. Commentators debated Michelle's alleged role in concealing Nick's